Welcome to Backbone Unlimited. My name is Matt Hartsky. In this episode, we're going to break down how to find elk during one of the toughest conditions you're going to face in the mountains, a heat wave. I have a feeling with our dry winter across much of the West and recorded high temperatures like we've had, well above average, we could be in for a very hot elk season as well. And I want you to be prepared. If you're not familiar with who I am, I've been hunting and guiding Western big game for over 34 years, and I've been a professional strength conditioning and nutrition coach for more than 30 years, and I'm here to help you become a more successful and consistent elk hunter and outdoorsman. Heat can make a lot of elk seasons fall apart. The mountains feel dead. There's no bugles, no movement. Sign goes cold, and a lot of hunters assume that the elk have disappeared or moved miles away, but that's usually not what's happening. Elk don't usually leave, they just kind of tighten up. Heat forces elk into smaller, more controlled patterns built around shade, wind, and survival. And if you don't understand that shift, you're going to end up hunting empty country while elk are sitting tight in very predictable locations. In this episode, I'm going to show you how heat actually simplifies elk behavior and how you can use that to your advantage to consistently find elk when a lot of hunters can't. When a heat wave hits, elk don't stop moving. They become extremely efficient with how and when they move. In normal conditions, elk might feed longer into morning and begin evening movement earlier. But in the heat, those windows really shrink. Most of their feeding happens at night, and by the time daylight hits, they're already close to bedding cover or already bedded. This is where a lot of elk hunters fall behind without even realizing it. If you're getting into position at first light, you're late. You're no longer intercepting elk in transition. You're walking into where they've already settled. And in thick cover, that usually means you never see them or you're bumping them. Heat forces elk into short, controlled movements between feed and bed. They avoid exposure, limit travel distance, and prioritize terrain that offers shade and wind advantage. The key shift you need to make is this: try to stop thinking about where elk should be moving. Start thinking about where elk are forced to be when movement is limited. Because in the heat, elk patterns don't disappear, they just tighten. And when you recognize that, you stop chasing elk and start getting in front of them. When temperatures rise, a lot of elk hunters immediately shift their focus to water. It makes sense on the surface. Hot weather, animals need water. But this is where a lot of guys oversimplify what elk are actually doing. Elk don't live on the water, right? They just use it more strategically. During a heat wave, elk will typically hit water at night, really early in the morning, or occasionally just before bedding, but they don't spend daylight hours just hanging around water sources unless they feel completely secure, and most of the time, unless you're on private ground, they don't. And that's why sitting water can be inconsistent even in extreme heat. The better way to think about this is water influences where elk position themselves, not where they stay all day. Elk are going to choose bedding areas that give them reasonable access to water without sacrificing security, shade, or wind advantage. And that often puts them above or off to the side of water sources, not directly on them. So instead of hunting water itself, try to start looking for north facing timber above creeks, benches near drainages, and shaded bedding zones within short travel distance of water. That's where elk actually spend their time during a heat wave. When heat takes over the mountain, elk don't just look for shade, they look for environments that stay consistently cooler throughout the day. And that's where north facing slopes and dark timber come into play. North slopes receive less direct sunlight, right? Which means cooler ground temperatures, better moisture retention, and more stable thermals. Combine that with thick timber, and you get what I call a thermal protection zone, an area where elk can stay comfortable without having to move much. And movement is exactly what elk are trying to avoid in the heat. They're a big critter. Inside those zones, elk can bed longer, conserve energy, and maintain a consistent wind advantage. They're not exposed. They're not traveling. They're set up in a place that allows them to survive the heat with minimal effort. And here's what a lot of elk hunters get wrong: they hunt the edges of those areas expecting elk to step out. But during a heat wave, elk don't hang on the edges. They bury themselves inside that stuff. And that means tighter terrain, darker cover, and less visibility. If you're not willing to adjust to that, you're going to keep glassing empty country while elk are sitting just out of sight in places that make the most sense to them. Now, midday during a heat wave is where elk become probably the most predictable, but only if you understand what they're prioritizing. At this point in the day, elk are no longer thinking about feeding or traveling. They're focused on holding a position that gives them maximum control with minimal movement. Every good bedding location during heat is built around three things: shade, wind, and escape routes. You'll consistently find elk bedded on north facing benches or slightly elevated off the bottom where they can catch consistent thermals and monitor what's below them. Those spots allow elk to use rising thermals early, shifting winds mid morning, and falling thermals later in the day, all without getting up. That consistent wind awareness is what keeps them alive. They're not randomly laying down in the timber, they're positioning themselves where they can detect danger from multiple directions while staying cool. And here's the key: once elk are bedded in those conditions, they're not moving unless something forces them to. And that means if you locate the right bedding terrain, you don't need elk to be active. You just need to be in the right place at the right time with the right approach. Now, one of the biggest adjustments you're going to have to make during a heat wave is accepting how small your opportunity window really is. In normal conditions, elk might move well into the morning and start getting active earlier in the evening. But in the heat, those windows shrink down to almost nothing. Morning movement might last 20 to 45 minutes, sometimes less, and a lot of times elk are already staged near bedding cover before it's even light enough to see. Evening is the same story, just flipped. Elk might not start moving until the last few minutes of shooting light if we're lucky, and when they do, they're not traveling far. They're stepping out just enough to feed before dark. And that creates what I call the short window problem. If you're not in position early enough, you miss it. If you leave too soon in the evening, you miss it. There's no margin for error here. This is where discipline becomes more important than effort. You have to commit to being set up early, staying patient, and understanding that long periods of inactivity are just part of the process in the heat. Because when movement happens in the heat, it happens fast and usually right on the edge of cover. Hey, if you hunt public land elk and you're tired of grinding through random seasons, I built the elk hunting series of ebooks for you. Most hunters don't struggle because they lack effort. They struggle because they lack a system. And that's exactly why I built the elk hunting ebook series as a complete progressive framework for Western elk hunters who are done guessing and ready to hunt with intention. Volume 1 is going to be Foundations and Reality. I reset your mindset and expose the assumptions that quietly wreck seasons. In Volume 2, Finding Elk and Understanding Pressure, you'll learn how elk actually move under pressure so you can anticipate instead of react. In Volume 3, Terrain, Wind, and Position, I break down how to use landscape and thermals to consistently create opportunities. In Volume 4, Calling, Silence, and Pressure, sound becomes a decision tool, not an impulse. In Volume 5, Bow Hunting Execution, we're talking about close range strategy so you can finish your encounters. And in Volume 6, Late Season and Post Rut, we're talking about how elk shift after the rut and how to adapt when others quit. This is a system built for consistency. This isn't theory, it's a structured system to help you find elk, read country, and make confident decisions every season. Buy each volume individually or bundle them all to save 50% off at backboneunlimited.com. Heat also has a way of shutting down one of the biggest tools elk hunters rely on, right? Sound. Bugles drop off. Vocal activity becomes more inconsistent. And for a lot of elk hunters, that creates doubt. They start covering more ground, calling more aggressively, or abandoning areas too quickly because they're not hearing anything. But silence doesn't mean absence. It just means the elk are operating on a tighter, more controlled system. During a heat wave, elk don't need to advertise their location. They're not moving much. They're not competing as aggressively, and they're not exposing themselves unless they absolutely have to. Everything becomes quieter, slower, and more deliberate. And that's where you have to make a mental shift. You're no longer hunting elk based on what you hear. You're hunting elk based on what makes sense. And that means trusting terrain, bedding structure, wind patterns and movement constraints over any kind of vocal feedback that you're not getting. You're no longer reacting to elk, you're having to anticipate them. And the elk hunters who struggle here are the ones waiting for confirmation. The hunters who succeed are the ones willing to move forward without it because they understand the system elk are operating in, even when it's completely silent. When a heat wave hits, you can't hunt on instinct or emotion. You need structure. And that's where having a repeatable system becomes critical because wasted movement and poor timing are going to cost you every single day. Your entire day needs to revolve around where elk already are, not where you hope they'll be. Mornings start before daylight. You should already be in position in your bedding terrain, not hiking toward it. Your goal is to catch that short transition window as elk finish feeding and slip into cover to bed. Midday is where a lot of hunters check out, but this is also where you can stay disciplined. You either slow hunt through high probability bedding zones with complete control of the wind, or you position yourself to observe shaded pockets and internal timber where elk are holding. Evenings require patience too. You don't chase movement. You set up tight to bedding areas and wait for elk to make minimal movements toward feed right before dark. Now, the biggest shift is this: you're no longer covering ground to find elk. You're controlling your movement to stay inside their little pattern. Every step has to be intentional because in the heat, elk aren't forgiving mistakes, right? Heat doesn't make elk harder to find, it just makes them more disciplined. They move less, but they move with purpose. They choose terrain that gives them shade, wind advantage, and security. And once they're there, they don't leave unless they have to. And that's where a lot of elk hunters get frustrated. They expect activity or noise or movement. And when it's not there, they assume the elk are gone. But they're probably not gone. They're just tighter in their patterns. If you understand how heat compresses movement, how it shifts elk into specific terrain, and how it reduces your window of opportunity, you can start hunting with more intention instead of hope during that heat. You're going to stop wandering and stop guessing. You're going to start putting yourself in the exact places elk are forced to be because in tough conditions like a heat wave, success doesn't just come from doing more, it comes from understanding more. Now, if you want to go deeper into elk movement, pressure patterns, terrain positioning, and structured decision making, that's exactly why I built the elk hunting series of ebooks. It's a progressive system designed to help you understand how elk actually use country and how to position yourself accordingly. I have a link to those ebooks in the description. If you want hands-on application and real-time breakdowns, we have an in-person Elk Camp 2026 that is built around this same philosophy: structure, preparation, and execution in real terrain. 90% of Elk Camp is going to be us running real scenarios with you. You can check that out at backboneunlimited.com. And if you want ongoing access to the Team Backbone community, classroom, my full digital vault of elk resources, private discussions, and direct communication to me for planning, you can join Team Backbone at backboneunlimited.com underneath our membership tab. Everything we talk about here is connected. Preparation is not a single video, it's a system. Thanks for being here. Until next time, train harder, hunt smarter, and never settle.